Louisiana, 1843. What becomes of a man who mistakes power for creation? What kind of silence settles over a house where love is measured in lineage, and flesh becomes the soil of ambition? Before we continue, make sure to subscribe so you never miss these haunting untold stories. The Beaumont plantation stood miles beyond the bayous, its white columns ghostly even in daylight, its fields stretching outward like a graveyard of motionless green. It was said the soil here was rich not just from water and ash, but from the bones that had fed it for generations. Colonel Silas Beaumont believed he owned not just land but destiny. Born from a family of planters and soldiers, Silas had inherited more than fortune. He had inherited the arrogance of believing the world could be arranged, catalogued, and perfected. To him, people were no different than cattle or corn. They could be bred, improved, made useful through order. His journals, bound in calfskin, lined the study walls, filled with diagrams and inked genealogies that mapped the bloodlines of his fields. Margaret Beaumont, his wife, had once been the heart of the house, pale, devout, and trained to maintain grace under silence. Yet as the years passed, her laughter vanished like a scent in a closed room. She had borne him 2 sons, Julian and Henry, and after them no more. Her husband had stopped asking. Instead, his gaze began to linger elsewhere, past the parlor curtains, down to the slave quarters beyond the oaks. Julian, the elder, carried his father's bearing but none of his mercy. He rode through the fields with a polished cane and eyes that never softened. Henry, the younger, was quieter, his hands stained with ink rather than dirt. He spent long hours in his father's study, learning the cold art of documentation. The ledger was sacred in that house. Every name, age, and number, the lifeblood of Beaumont legacy. It began as whispers among the enslaved. The master had new orders. Certain women were chosen for the program. The term was strange, foreign, but the consequences were clear. At first, the chosen were given better rations, cleaner clothes, and separate cabins near the main house. Then came the visits, at night, when the oil lamps were dim and the crickets screamed louder than prayers. Clara, a young housemaid of mixed blood, had grown up under that roof. Her mother had been born on the same land and buried behind the magnolia grove. Clara's eyes were sharp, her mind quicker than most dared show. She noticed everything, the way Mrs. Beaumont's hands trembled at supper, the new locks installed on the east wing doors, the nights when the colonel didn't come to bed. The other servants spoke in hushed voices, fearful that words alone might summon punishment. But there was no hiding the truth forever. By spring, the chosen women began to show the signs of life swelling beneath their ribs. The colonel called it selective breeding. To the overseers, he explained it as progress. He had charts proving the strength of new stock, claiming that mixed heritage produced more resilient workers. To Margaret, he spoke of God's design, as if Scripture itself had blessed his cruelty. But Margaret was no fool. She saw the shame stitched between every polite Sunday smile, heard the cries that carried across the fields at night. Her own sons looked away when she asked questions. The household grew colder. Even meals were taken in silence. Only the ticking clock above the dining room fireplace dared speak, its rhythm marking each descent into something unspeakable. By midsummer, the plantation had become a theater of ghosts. The enslaved moved like shadows, their eyes fixed on the ground. The Beaumont sons avoided their mother entirely, throwing themselves into their father's experiments. Silas had begun to keep a new ledger, one separate from the others, its pages marked not just with names but with crosses and birth cycles. He studied them like a man obsessed, comparing features, charting ancestry, and tracking the progress of his human stock. Clara once glimpsed those pages while cleaning his study. What she saw there made her throat tighten. A record of pairings, births, even deaths. Each name was written not as a person but as an equation, a formula toward something monstrous. She saw her own initials penciled faintly beside another, with the note, potential. That night she could not sleep. The air was heavy with thunder, the smell of rain and blood mingling from the nearby slaughterhouse. She heard footsteps above her, the colonel pacing his study. Then a voice, soft and trembling, Margaret's. The two argued, their words muffled by the floorboards, but Clara could make out fragments: sin, God, unnatural. Then a sudden crash. Silence. The next morning, Margaret appeared at breakfast with a bruise hidden beneath her lace collar. No one spoke of it. But something in the house shifted that day. The workers sensed it. Even the birds grew quiet near the veranda. Henry stopped attending church. Julian's temper grew vicious, striking without reason. The colonel smiled less, though his eyes burned brighter. And Margaret began wandering the halls at night, murmuring prayers to no one. Weeks passed and the new infants were born. Some bore pale skin, some dark, some with eyes so light they startled those who dared look too long. Silas kept them separate, documented them like trophies. His journals grew thicker. The house's library became a morgue of human history rewritten by his hand. Clara watched from the margins, her silence sharpening into resolve. She began to hide small things, a page from the ledger, a lock of hair, a name scrawled on paper, to remember those who would otherwise vanish into his arithmetic. The summer ended in drought. Cracks split the earth, and the fields turned brittle under the sun. The slaves whispered that God had turned his face away. Margaret stopped eating. The sons argued openly with their father but never disobeyed. And at night, the lanterns in the east wing flickered long past midnight, casting restless shadows against the windows like souls trying to escape. One night, Clara passed the open door of the study and saw the colonel bent over his desk, candlelight carving hollows in his face. His hands trembled as he wrote, and before him lay the latest entry, a new name. His own. The night that followed would haunt the Beaumont plantation for generations. The air was thick with heat and the hum of insects, the kind of suffocating silence that seemed to hold its breath. Outside, lightning cracked across the distant marshlands, and the house itself groaned like something alive, burdened by secrets too heavy for its walls. Colonel Silas Beaumont sat in his study, hunched over his desk. The candle burned low, dripping wax that resembled tears upon his open ledger. His pen trembled between his fingers, blotting ink across the parchment. The pages were filled not with accounts of harvests or debts, but of births, features, and bloodlines. In the margins, he had begun to write phrases that no one else could decipher: correction of flaw, purity through contrast, reclaimed lineage. But now, something darker had begun to appear. The latest entries were erratic, fevered, written by a hand that had started to lose reason. On the newest page, beneath columns of names, was written in bold script, "The experiment requires completion." And below that, as if added in hesitation, "By my own seed." Margaret had read those words the following morning. She had crept into the study at dawn, barefoot, her nightgown trailing across the dusty floor. Silas had fallen asleep in his chair, his head resting on his arm, the ledger still open before him. She had only meant to extinguish the candle before it burned down to the wood, but then her eyes caught the writing. Her hands shook as she turned the page. She found names she recognized, Clara's among them, and beside them the initials of her own sons. For a moment her body forgot how to breathe. The horror that filled her was not sudden. It was slow, deliberate, the realization of something that had been growing in shadow for years. When Silas stirred awake, she was standing before him, the ledger in her hands. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling like glass. He rose slowly, his face unreadable in the half-light. "I have done what God intended," he replied. "To perfect the human line, to mend what time and sin have broken." Margaret's expression twisted between disbelief and terror. "You have damned us all." He reached toward her, not in violence but in conviction. "You mistake damnation for design. I have seen what nature creates when left to chance. Weakness, decay. This house will endure because I will make it endure. Do you not see, Margaret? Our sons will inherit something greater than land. They will inherit a new order of blood." She stepped back, clutching the ledger against her chest as though it were a living thing. "And what of the women you've defiled? The children born without a name? What do they inherit, Silas?" He said nothing. His silence was the kind that echoed. That evening, Margaret locked herself in her room. The house fell under a pall of dread. The servants whispered that the mistress had lost her mind. Others claimed she prayed through the night, begging forgiveness for sins not her own. Clara, who had overheard fragments of their argument through the study door, knew now that the evil within this house was deeper than she had feared. She had seen cruelty before, but not obsession sanctified as reason. She began to plan. Weeks passed and the summer storms rolled in. Each night, thunder shook the windows and the sky bled with light. In those hours, Clara began her quiet rebellion. She crept into the study when the house slept, stealing a page from the ledger each time, documenting the names, the pairings, the experiments. She hid them beneath a loose board in her quarters, swearing that one day the truth would be known. But the house seemed to sense betrayal. One night, as Clara slipped the stolen pages beneath the floor, she heard the slow creak of footsteps outside her door. She froze. The handle turned. And there, framed in the lightning's brief flash, stood Julian Beaumont, the elder son. He was holding the ledger. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Julian said softly, "Father knows." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Knows what? She whispered. Julian's face, so like his father's, was pale and damp with sweat. That you've taken from him. That you've seen the book. He sent me to find you. Clara's voice trembled. And will you? He stared at her, his jaw clenched. You don't understand. He's not the man he was. He doesn't sleep, he doesn't eat. He speaks to the dead in his journals. Julian's hand tightened on the ledger's spine. He believes the children, those born of his experiments, speak through him now. Lightning tore across the sky again. In its light, Clara saw tears glistening in Julian's eyes. Help me, he said quietly, before he destroys us all. Outside, the wind howled through the oaks like a warning. That night the two of them went to the study. The house was asleep, but the sense of being watched never left them. Julian carried a lantern, its small flame trembling in his grip. On the desk lay another ledger, new, blank, waiting to be filled. Silas Beaumont's handwriting was on the first line. The second generation begins. Clara felt sick. Julian whispered, we burn them. All of them. But when he opened the cabinet to retrieve the other books, something fell to the floor, a bundle wrapped in linen damp with age. When Clara unwrapped it, her stomach turned to ice. Inside were sketches, portraits of the women Silas had used, drawn in exquisite detail as though they were specimens. Their eyes were lifeless, their expressions serene, like saints painted for a church that had forgotten God. And beneath the sketches, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, the same color Margaret Beaumont had worn on her wedding day. Julian stared in horror. Mother? Before they could speak again, the floorboards above them creaked. The sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate, descended the stairs. The lantern flickered. Clara's heart pounded in her throat. Julian whispered, hide. But it was too late. The study door swung open and there, framed in the lantern's light, stood Silas Beaumont. His eyes gleamed like wet coal. For a long, breathless moment no one spoke. Then he said, his voice low and calm, I warned you, Julian. Some knowledge is not meant to be unlearned. Clara stepped backward, clutching the bundle to her chest. Silas's gaze followed her movement. Ah, he murmured. So you were the thief. Julian moved between them. This ends tonight. Silas smiled, a slow, terrible smile. Yes, he said. It does. Outside, thunder split the sky and the candle blew out. The storm that night never truly ended. Even as dawn crept over the horizon, the air remained thick with the smell of rain and smoke. The sky was an ashen gray, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what had happened within the walls of the Beaumont estate. When Clara awoke, her throat burned with soot. The study was half destroyed, its shelves blackened, and the floor covered in ash and splintered glass. Julian was gone. So was Silas. Only the faint crackle of smoldering wood and the smell of burned paper lingered to tell her that something terrible had taken place while the world slept. She staggered to her feet, her mind clouded with terror and disbelief. The bundle of sketches, those faces of the forgotten, was gone too. In its place she found a single object lying amid the ruin, Silas Beaumont's ring still warm, its engraved B blackened by fire. Outside the plantation was eerily silent. The servants avoided her gaze, whispering to each other in fearful tones. No one spoke of what they had seen or heard during the night, though the glow of fire had lit the sky for miles. By midday rumors had already begun to spread through the nearby town. Some said lightning had struck the estate, others that madness had consumed the master's family. But Clara knew the truth was far worse. By nightfall she discovered Julian in the north field. His clothes were torn, his hands blistered from smoke. He was kneeling in the mud beside a half-dug pit, staring at something half-buried in the earth. When she approached, her breath caught in her throat. It was a body. Silas Beaumont lay motionless, his face turned upward, the expression on it eerily peaceful, as though he had finally found rest. His hands were clasped over his chest, and beside him, half-charred, was the ledger. Julian didn't look up. He set the fire himself, he said, his voice hollow. Said it was purification. That only through destruction could perfection be reborn. Clara crouched beside him, her voice trembling. Then he's gone. Julian finally looked at her, his eyes distant, almost childlike. No, he whispered. He isn't gone. He said I was to continue his work. That it was my duty now. The words chilled her to the bone. That night, the plantation house stood like a ghost of itself, half-burned, its corridors dark, its portraits blackened. But deep in the cellar, beneath the ashes, something still glowed. Clara discovered it by accident when she noticed smoke seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. She lifted a loose plank and found the faint shimmer of embers. Beneath them was a small wooden chest, untouched by the flames. Inside were vials, small corked glass containers filled with what looked like blood. Each one was labeled with a date and a name. Some names she recognized from the ledger. Others she didn't. At the very bottom of the chest was a note written in Silas's unmistakable hand. Preserve the seed. The body perishes but the line endures. Clara felt her stomach twist. The truth hit her all at once. Silas hadn't merely recorded his experiments. He had preserved them. The fire hadn't been an end, it had been a baptism. She smashed the vials one by one against the stone wall until her hands bled. The glass cut deep, but she didn't stop until every trace of his legacy was gone. When she emerged, covered in ash and blood, Julian stood at the top of the stairs watching her. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice sharp, desperate. "I ended it," she said through trembling lips. "Whatever he started, it dies here." But Julian shook his head, his expression breaking into something between fury and sorrow. "You don't understand. It's already in us. In me." He pressed his hands to his chest, his eyes wide and feverish. "He said it would take root. That the fire was to awaken it." Clara backed away, her heart pounding. "Julian." He took a step closer, his face illuminated by the flicker of a nearby lamp. There was something wrong in his eyes, something not entirely human. "You should have let it burn, Clara. Now it's too late." That night the servants fled. The house was left to its ruin, the crops to wither. And in the weeks that followed, the townsfolk began to speak of strange cries echoing from the fields, voices that sounded almost like laughter, almost like weeping. Months later, when the county sheriff finally arrived to investigate, he found the estate deserted. The house was overrun with vines, the floors soft with decay. In the cellar, beneath the scorched beams, they found a single unbroken vial, labeled Julian, August 1859. Inside it was something black and thick, pulsing faintly as if still alive. Years passed before anyone dared return. The land changed hands, names were forgotten, and the Beaumont legacy was buried beneath history's dust. But locals still told stories, of the fire that never went out, of the man who tried to breed perfection, and of the woman who watched the world she knew collapse in smoke and madness. And every so often, when the wind blew from the north, children swore they could hear whispering in the fields, a voice saying again and again, "Preserve the seed." The house may have burned, but its shadow endured. By the spring of 1863, the Beaumont plantation was a husk of its former self. Ivy swallowed its walls, windows sagged like tired eyes, and what was once a house of wealth and cruelty had become a mausoleum. The land refused to yield crops, the soil blackened by ash and rot, as if the earth itself had sworn never to bear fruit again. Clara returned alone. She had wandered for years, drifting through towns, working under false names, haunted by the memory of Julian's final words and the sickly light in his eyes. But something, perhaps guilt, perhaps the need to see the truth buried with her own hands, had drawn her back. The locals had long stopped approaching the estate. They called it the Cursed Acres. Some claimed the soil moved on its own, that whispers rose from the cornfields when the moon was low. Others said they'd seen lights in the burned-out windows, figures moving slowly as if reenacting the sins of the past. Clara walked through the charred halls with the quiet reverence of one visiting a tomb. Dust hung thick in the air. The portraits had peeled beyond recognition, the wood warped, but in one corner of the parlor she found a familiar shape, the frame of the family painting. The faces were gone, the paint eaten by flame, but faintly she could still make out the outlines of three figures: Silas, Julian, and herself. She touched her own faded likeness, tracing the blackened edge of her cheek. The wood splintered beneath her fingers, revealing a hollow behind it. Inside the cavity was a single page, perfectly preserved from the fire. The writing was unmistakable. Silas's hand again, elegant, deliberate. "Should the flesh perish, the blood will remember. Memory is inheritance. The body is only soil." At the bottom of the page was a seal, an intricate symbol burned faintly into the parchment. It wasn't the family crest. It was older. Something alchemical, circular, as if drawn from an ancient book. Clara's hands shook. She turned the page over and saw one final message, written in a trembling scrawl not by Silas, but by Julian. "He lives. Beneath the fields. I saw him. I am him." She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. Beneath the fields. The words echoed in her mind as she rushed through the decaying corridors, out into the open air. The sky was blood red, heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. She ran past the ruins of the stables, the dry well, the barn that had long collapsed into the earth, until she reached the north field, the place where Silas had been buried. The mound was still there, marked by nothing but the faint outline of a stone cross. Grass had grown over it, tall and pale, swaying like restless ghosts. She dropped to her knees and began to dig. Her fingers tore through the soil, black and cold, until they met wood. The lid of the coffin was splintered, almost soft to the touch. She pried it open with shaking hands. Inside there was no body. Only a dark, pulsing mass, something that looked like soil but breathed like flesh. It quivered at her touch, releasing a faint whisper that wasn't wind. "Preserve the seed." Clara screamed and fell back, scrambling away as the ground beneath the coffin began to shift. Roots, thin, black and glistening, spread outward through the soil like veins. The mound collapsed inward with a low groan, and for a moment she thought she saw something emerge, something vaguely human in shape but eyeless, its form dissolving into the earth as quickly as it appeared. Rain began to fall. Heavy, relentless. It soaked the ground until the field became a mire, swallowing the remnants of the grave. The storm raged for hours as if the heavens themselves sought to drown the curse that lingered beneath. By morning the field was still. The mound was gone. Only the faint imprint of a human shape remained in the mud. Clara didn't speak of what she had seen. She burned the parchment, the seal, everything that bore the name Beaumont. Then she left for good, never to return. But the land didn't forget. Decades passed. The plantation was bought and sold by strangers. The new owners spoke of failing harvests and strange noises at night. Workers quit after claiming to see silhouettes standing among the corn rows at dusk, figures that didn't move when called to and vanished when approached. By 1901 the land was abandoned again. Locals told children never to wander too close, for the fields were said to remember their roots. In 1937, a historian researching antebellum estates uncovered fragments of the Beaumont ledger in an archive, charred, incomplete. He wrote of one entry that puzzled him: specimen reborn through soil structure, viable. The historian dismissed it as pseudoscience. Yet in the same year, a botanist studying the wild growth on the property collected samples of the plants that grew only within the bounds of the old plantation. Their roots were unnaturally dark, dense, and when cut, bled faintly red. He destroyed the samples within days. And so the Beaumont story became a whisper in Southern folklore, a tale of vanity, sin, and the curse of playing God. Travelers spoke of strange, black flowers that only grew where the blood had once soaked the earth. Some said if you listened closely on humid nights, you could still hear a voice rising from the soil, a voice that spoke in the tone of a man long dead, murmuring the same words over and over, "preserve the seed." No one ever proved it. But no one ever stayed on that land long enough to try. Time washed over the ruins and the Beaumont name faded from history. But history, as always, has a way of remembering what the living wish to forget. Even now, the North Field stands untouched, grass too thick, soil too dark, the wind too cold for comfort. And in certain photographs taken by travelers who don't know better, faint shapes can sometimes be seen between the rows of dead corn. They look almost human. And if you stare long enough, one might appear to turn its head and smile. If you like this story, don't forget to like this video. It helps us bring more stories that haunts you.